Okay, so now we are going to talk about how to approximate numbers on a number line. So we have an idea here of what is a rational number and an irrational number, but again, we should be able to approximate or take a very good guess on where these numbers would be without using a calculator. So because we're approximating, we're not as concerned about what the exact number is, but we want to get as close to what that exact number would be as possible. So first we have the square root of 45. By knowing our perfect squares, I know that the square root of 45 is in between the square root of 36 and the square root of 49. I know that the square root of 36 is 6 and the square root of 49 is 7. So now I know that the square root of 45 is in between 6 and 7, so it's got to be 6 point something. And if we want to take a better guess on where it would be, because 45 is a little bit closer to 49 than it is 36, I know it's going to be past the halfway mark. So it's going to be past 6.5. So we are going to take a guess and say this is around 6.7. Again, it might be 6.6, it might be 6.8. That's not necessarily our concern with these problems when we're approximating. We just want to get as close to the real value as possible. So the square root of 45 is in between 6 and 7. We said about 6.7. So I'm going to put a mark at about where I think that is. Put down the square root of 45. And we're done with problem number 1. Next, we have problem number 2. Now, in earlier grades, 5th, 6th grade, you worked on how to take an improper fraction and how to change that into a mixed number. We are going to take a different approach here. So if you wanted to do that, that would be great and that would be fine. We're going to try to talk about how to do this more mentally to where you don't have to break it down. So I know that with 28 over 5, I know that 25 divided by 5 is equal to 5. And I know that 30 divided by 5 is equal to 6. So because 28 is in between 25 and 30, then I know that 28 divided by 5 has to be in between 5 and 6. So it's going to be 5 point something. Now 28 is pretty close to the middle, except it's a little bit closer to 30 by one number. So I'm going to go just a little bit past halfway and say that this is about 5.6. Again, we could be a decimal place off, but this is a really good guess or a really good approximation on where 28 over 5 is on the number line. So 28 over 5 is right in between 5 and 6, maybe a little bit closer to 6. So I make my mark, and there is 28 over 5. Done with problem number 2. Problem number 3, we're going to use the exact same strategy that we used for number 1. So instead of the square root of 45 here, we have the square root of 65. So I know that the square root of 64 is equal to 8, and I know that the square root of 81 is equal to 9. So because 65 is in between 64 and 81, then the square root of 65 has to be in between 8 and 9. So it's going to be about 8 point something, and now we want to see and look at which number it's closer to. So since 65 is just one more than 64, I can be very confident in saying that the square root of 65 is going to be about 8.1. It could even be less than that, 8.0 something, but it's going to be just a tad bit past 8. So I have my number line here. I find 8. I can make my mark, and that is the square root of 65. Done with problem number 3. Last, we have number 4. So this one takes a little bit more thinking into it. We're going to take a similar approach to what we did for number 2, except this is going to be an irrational number because we have pi in the problem. So first thing we want to do, we kind of want to break this down and see what is 3 pi. So we know that pi is about 3.14. And then, so we're going to do 3 times 3.14 times 2. Now again, if you didn't have pencil and paper, you might not work this out exactly the way I'm doing it, but mentally, we want to do this as fast as we can. So 3 times 3.14 is going to give us about 9.48. Again, as long as we know it's close to 9.5, we're in really good shape. So what we are doing, we are dividing that by 2. So now we want to approximate this fraction. I know that 9 divided by 2 is 4.5, 4.5, and I know that 10 divided by 2 is exactly 5. So since we're doing 9.5 basically divided by 2, it's going to be about halfway in between 4.5 and 5. So we can say that 3 pi over 2 is about 4.7. Because 9.48, or we can round that to 9.5, is right in between 4.5 and 5, then we can go exactly in between that. So on our number line here, I've got 4 and 5. Right there would be about 4.5, so we want to move halfway with that area. So about right there is where I can make my mark, and that is where we'll say 3 pi over 2 is. We are done with that problem, and now you know more.